Doctoral student here at the Graduate Center. I'm also the chair of the Critical Palestine Studies Association, and it's my pleasure to bring Norman Finkelstein here tonight for a talk on his new book. Norman Finkelstein is currently teaching at Sakarya University in Turkey. He's the author of such books as The Holocaust Industry, What Gandhi Says About Nonviolence, Resistance and Courage, Knowing Too Much, Why the American Jewish Romance with Israel is Coming to an End, Old Wine, Broken Bottle, Ari Shavid's Promised Land, and most recently, of course, Method and Madness, the hidden story of Israel's assault on Gaza. So with that, I'll hand it over to Professor Finkelstein.
Well, thank you for having me here. I'm going to be speaking this evening on what happened in Gaza, about already now coming to a year from a year ago. Time does fly. And I'm going to try to focus on the areas which have now become so fantastically distorted and falsified, in my opinion, by places which you would have expected better from. Places like Amnesty International, which seems to be succumbing to pressures and regressing to a period in its history on the Israel-Palestine conflict, which was not very admirable. Today I read the report that was issued yesterday by the United Nations on the attacks on the UN facilities in Gaza, and it was actually quite interesting to read for reasons which, if my memory doesn't betray me, I'll get to later. But it confirms once again an opinion I have reached after many years of studying this conflict, that you really don't have any sense of what goes on there unless you train your eye on the details, because the other side has such a spectacular, efficient, well-oiled propaganda machine that it eventually swallows up everything in its reach. And unless you look at those details, you don't quite know what's going on. I'll just illustrate it, though I shouldn't jump to the end at the beginning. One of the things that struck me in reading the UN report, bear in mind the UN report was issued not as an official document of any of the agencies affiliated with the UN. It wasn't the Human Rights Council or the Human Rights Commission or any number of other agencies. It was mandated by the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, who is just a US puppet. And so he constituted the committee. You can be certain that every member was approved by the United States and Israel, and that these kinds of ad hoc committees that he creates have a record, at least one track record, of producing sheer, unadulterated rubbish, namely the report that came to be called the Palmer Commission report on the Israeli assault on the Mavi Marmara. And this is his second go at it. And notwithstanding, as I said, the hand-picked or cherry-picked composition of the investigative group, the commission mandated to find out what happened during the Israeli assaults on the UN facilities. Israel attacked, as I'll get to later, 7 UN facilities. 6 of the 7 were converted from schools. UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Work Agency, UNRWA schools, they were converted during the Israeli assault on Gaza. They were converted into shelters. So 6 of the 7 were UN schools converted into shelters. And the commission was supposed to investigate the assault on those places, which I'll get to later. And they also had to look at those horrible, ghastly crimes committed by the, let's just call for shorthand, Hamas, though it's not just Hamas, but Hamas in Gaza. Now, everybody in this room knows, it's no secret, everybody in this room knows that during Israel's assault on Gaza, Hamas was accused of having stored weapons in UN schools, UN facilities. Not only schools, but UN facilities. And that was big news, as everyone remembered. Hamas was storing weapons. This vindicated the Israelis. UNRWA, which is a very decent organization, in my opinion, it issued these press releases saying that Hamas had stored rockets in these schools. And already it was known back then, it wasn't a matter of controversy. In fact, these UN schools had been closed for the summer. These were schools that had been shut down for the summer recess. Okay, it's still a violation of UN protocol to have stored weapons, rockets in these schools. Fair enough, didn't seem to me on the highest order of magnitude of war crimes. It wasn't like Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but okay, I'll accept it. So then today, I opened up the report, curious. So what went on? And I'll just read you, time won't allow me, and I don't want to keep you folks too long. It's a nice day here today in New York. But I opened up the report to see exactly what happened in the schools. So just give you one example. They said that 3 schools had been used as weapons caches for Hamas. So school number 1. On July 29th, a 120 millimeter mortar tube, a 120 millimeter mortar bipod, and 3 120 millimeter mortar containers were found. So what we're talking about is 1 mortar and 3 mortar shells. This was the big story, how that criminal gang in Gaza had breached international law. The second school was 1 mortar and 20 mortar shells. The third school, they couldn't even identify what the weapon was. They said it was likely a weapon. It was under a blanket. They don't even know what the weapon was. Now, when you look at this inventory, I think to myself, most private residences in Idaho and Montana have larger weapons stockpiles than what you found in these 3 schools in Gaza. Incidentally, even UNRWA, which, as I said, I don't say it facetiously, it's a decent organization for sure. Even they, in their press releases, referred to rockets being stored in these schools. And it's acknowledged in the report when they quote the UNRWA press releases, they put afterwards paren SIC, acknowledging it was 3 mortar shells. But we'll get back later to the more interesting question, or as interesting a question, namely the story behind the Hamas rockets that never were. So let me first go through quickly the background to what happened in Gaza, and then get up to the more interesting stuff, namely, in my opinion, the misrepresentations of what occurred. Everything starts pretty much at the end of April 2014, when the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and the Islamic resistance, Hamas, in Gaza, announced the formation of what was called a government of national consensus. And the surprising result was, or a surprising result was, officially Hamas is a terrorist group both in Europe, according to the EU, and according to the US. Hamas is a terrorist group. But surprisingly, the US and the EU, they decided not to suspend relationships with the new government and basically adopted what you might call a wait-and-see approach. Secondly, the new government, or its interim leadership, namely Mr. Abbas, he announced that he reiterated his support for what's called the three conditions for negotiations, namely renunciation of violence, recognition of Israel, and recognition of all past agreements, like the Oslo Agreement, the roadmap, and so forth. He reiterated his support for those terms, and the Hamas did not renege from its agreement to form the unity government of national consensus. And so Hamas was committing a cardinal sin, namely it was carrying on in a too moderate fashion, what one Israeli political scientist, Avner Yaniv, called, he says, it's these Palestinian peace offensives which irk Israel to no end. Mr. Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, he went into a rage. He described this new unity government as threatening, as always, a second Holocaust on Israel. But he couldn't do very much more than rage because the US and the EU seemed pretty determined not to break off relations. In part, it was retaliation by the US because Netanyahu had sabotaged the Kerry peace offensive. He was, he meaning Kerry, was upset at that, and so now he was getting his revenge by refusing to break off relations with this new government of national consensus. Netanyahu raged, he fumed. This was the second time he was being slighted. The first time was when the the five permanent members of the UN plus Germany, what's called the 5+1, were carrying on negotiations with Iran, even though, according to Netanyahu, Iran was also threatening a second Holocaust on Israel. It seems everybody is threatening a second Holocaust on Israel. And so Mr. Netanyahu was doubly enraged now. First, he was being ignored on Iran, and now he was being ignored on Hamas. As I said, he wasn't able to do very much until the middle of June, when 3 Israeli teenagers were kidnapped in the West Bank, and now Mr. Netanyahu had his pretext. Israel knew almost immediately two things. You could say within 24 hours, Israel knew, number one, the kids were dead. They were killed almost immediately, and the Israelis knew it. Mr. Netanyahu knew it. And number two, they knew that the Hamas leadership was not, had not authorized this kidnapping. It was apparently a local group based in Hebron, were having some connections with Gaza, which was responsible. But the facts were beside the point. Mr. Netanyahu is a politician. He's also very media savvy, and he knew this was an opportunity. And he doesn't let opportunities pass because they're very rare in politics, and you have to exploit that opportunity. Or as the expression has it, you have to strike while the iron is hot. And so now Mr. Netanyahu launched what came to be called Operation Brother's Keeper. The Israeli army went into the West Bank, carried on like marauders, blew up homes, killed about 5 or 6 Palestinians, arrested about 500 Palestinians in the West Bank. Overwhelmingly, it was Hamas members. And the purpose of this rampage, ransacking businesses, was perfectly clear. Everybody understood it. The purpose was to evoke some sort of irrational, crazy reaction from Hamas so that Netanyahu could say to the U.S., you see, I told you, they're terrorists. You can't negotiate with them. And in fact, later on, he did say to the U.S. State Department, he said, never second guess me again on Hamas. So he tried to evoke a crazy reaction. As it happened, Hamas held back, it held back, it held back. But the other armed groups in Gaza did react. As I recall, Islamic Jihad did react. And then things quickly spiraled out of control. And a new Israeli assault on Gaza had begun, called Operation Protective Edge. It should be borne in mind, it is easily forgotten, and I will acknowledge I'm among those who are guilty of forgetting, that these rampages on Gaza they're not annual events, but it can be said that they're near annual events. So for those of you who follow the events closely, you'll know that in the last 10 years, Israel has launched against Gaza. I don't think I have the order correct. You'll excuse me if I have the chronology wrong. Operation Summer Rains, Operation Hot Winter, Operation Days of Penitence, then the better-known ones, Operation Cast Lead, Operation Pillar of Defense, and then Operation Protective Edge. As I said, if not on an annual basis, certainly on a consistent basis, Israel unleashes its lethal war machine on what David Cameron, the current Prime Minister of the UK, he called himself, and he's certainly not what you would call a radical, he's a conservative, what he himself called the largest open-air prison in the world. So Israel launches on July 8th what's called Operation Protective Edge. And basically from the beginning, Netanyahu was faced with a dilemma. Some of you might recall that the big question was they had unleashed their air force and their artillery, but there was the question of whether there would be a ground assault on Gaza. And Netanyahu held back, he held back, he held back. And it's interesting to look at why he held back, because Israel has this dilemma that it constantly faces, or at least has been facing since Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9. And the dilemma goes something like this. Israel is a Sparta-like society, and in a Sparta-like society, actually, combatant deaths are seen as a source of more sorrow than civilian deaths. The combatant is the most valued, the fighter, as the Israelis like to call them, the combatant or the fighter is the most revered figure in Israeli society. And so a combatant death is a source of national tragedy. How do you avert combatant deaths? Well, it's very simple. The way to avert combatant deaths is, if you launch a ground invasion, you go in and you decimate everything to the left of you, everything to the right of you, and everything in front of you. That's a very simple way to avoid combatant deaths. And that was Israel's strategy, for example, during Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9. Went in, and we know it's not a matter of speculation, because a lot of the soldiers came forward afterwards, and they said honestly what were their orders. The orders that they were given repeatedly was, if anything moves, just destroy everything. Anything moves, because back then too, in 2008-9, Olmert's big fear was those combatant deaths, because Israeli society, domestic society, doesn't tolerate those combatant deaths. And in fact, it worked very well during Operation Cast Lead. 1,400 Palestinians were killed, up to 1,200 were civilians. On the Israeli side, there were 13 casualties, 3 civilians. 10 combatant deaths, and even of the 10 combatant deaths, 4 of the 10 were a result of what's called friendly fire, when Israeli soldiers accidentally killed each other. There were all of 6 combatant deaths during cast lead, and the reason was perfectly obvious, because everything in front and to the sides of the Israelis was flattened. If you read the reports from the cast lead, and I went through them quite carefully, virtually every soldier who was asked said, I never saw a Hamas, their terms, terrorist, I never saw one. Over and over again, they kept saying, we never saw one, we never saw one. Of course they never saw one, because they destroyed everything all around them. There was no war in Gaza. You know, as one Israeli soldier put it during cast lead, he said it was like a child with a magnifying glass burning up ants. That's what Gaza looked like in 2008. Another one said it was like a PlayStation computer game. You never saw the Hamas militants. And that's the way you keep combatant deaths low. So the big question that might be perplexing you is, so why didn't they do it again? Why didn't he just invade? Well, he had a problem. The problem was the aftermath of cast lead in 2008-9. It did evoke a loud international reaction. And then that international reaction culminated in the Goldstone report. And there were real fears on the part of the Israelis that Israeli soldiers were going to be prosecuted. Oh, and not just Israeli soldiers, Israeli officials like Tzipi Livni, that they were going to suffer prosecution. Because the international community, the reaction was that Israel had crossed the threshold in what Amnesty International called the 22 days of death and destruction in Gaza in 2008-9. So the basic dilemma facing Israel was the following. If we go into Gaza and there are a large number of combatant deaths, we lose the domestic population. If we go in and blast everything in sight, then we have a problem with the international community. So what do you do? And Netanyahu didn't know what to do. He held back, he held back, he held back. He held back until July 17th. And it's quite interesting what happened July 17th. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but on the other hand, I do respect political savvy of politicians. On July 17th, nobody will remember here. Oh, you do remember. What happened?
The killing of Muhammad?
No. No. Yeah, July 17th was the downing of the Malaysian airliner over the Ukraine. And you might be wondering, okay, what's going on here? What does the downing of the Ukrainian airliner have to do with Gaza? In fact, it has everything to do with Gaza. Why? Well, now we're going to have to introduce yet another variable. We have to go back to the first Intifada in Palestine between 1987 and basically between 1987 and 1990. The uprising in Palestine was very successful, evoked a considerable international reaction. For Israel, it was this horrible, awful public relations debacle. These kids with stones their bones being broken, them being killed in quite terrible ways, nonviolent resistance. And in March 1989, some of you remember, most of you won't because you're way too young, there was the Tiananmen massacre in China. Now, I'm sure everybody's head is spinning. We've gone from Palestine to the Ukraine. Now we're in China. What's going on here? In fact, everything fits together, and you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to understand it, to believe it. What happened was Netanyahu gave a speech at Bar-Ilan University in 1989, and he said Israel made a big mistake. He said the big mistake was when all the cameras shifted from the Intifada to the Tiananmen massacre. He said Israel should have exploited that opportunity to carry out a large-scale expulsion in the West Bank. And now, with the downing of the Ukrainian airliner, the Malaysian airliner over the Ukraine, it was Netanyahu's Tiananmen moment. he realized, now I have a chance. All the cameras quickly moved from Gaza to the Ukraine, and Netanyahu's no fool when it comes to managing the media. That's his trademark skill. And if you look at the record, July 17th in the afternoon, the airliner is downed. July 17th at night, Netanyahu announces the ground invasion of Gaza. The ground invasion basically was a out-and-out terror attack on the people of Gaza. To just go, if you'll allow me for 1 second, I want to just get my notes, some of my notes. Okay, thank you. Israel targeted homes, businesses, schools, mosques, hospitals, ambulances, power stations, sewage plants, civilian shelters, fleeing citizens. It was a carnage on an impressive scale. The purpose was perfectly obvious. It was like all terrorist campaigns, by the definition of what is a terrorist campaign. The purpose was to try to either break the will of the people of Gaza through these terrorist attacks, or to get them to turn against Hamas because of it's quote-unquote all Hamas's fault. In fact, they were even hoping, the Israelis, that the Hamas leaders were in the shelters, that midway the leaders themselves would come out of the shelters or the tunnels, come out, see all the damage that was done, and then agree to a surrender. To give you a basic picture of what happened at the end, and here I think the numbers are quite telling, and it's interesting to juxtapose the numbers with what happened among the Israelis, because all the human rights organizations, they're now trying to affect this kind of balance, as if both sides suffered equally or near equally in what happened, and both sides were equally guilty of war crimes. And you can see the difference. Amnesty, which was really quite good in the past 20 years, its report on Gaza in 2008-9 was called Gaza, 22 Days of Death and Destruction. It was clear where they stood. This time around, it was really quite awful what they wrote, their report on Gaza. I won't have time now to go through the details, but I'll be writing it up in tedious detail, but I think it deserves to be, the attention deserves to be called to it. So let's just quickly look at the numbers. On the Palestinian side, 2,300 Palestinians were killed. Of those 2,300, the estimates are, the low estimate is 70% were civilians. The estimates by the two human rights organizations, and the two respected human rights organizations in Gaza, they put it at 75%. So 2,300 people killed, about 70 to 75% civilians, or about 1,600 were civilians. Children killed, the estimate is, it's not an estimate, it's a number now. The number of children that were killed was 548. Now, let's turn to the Israeli side. On the Israeli side, it was 73 Israelis were killed. Of those 73, 67 were combatants. 6 of them were civilians, or to use percentages, in the case of the Palestinians, between 70 and 75% were civilians. In the case of Israel, 8% were civilians. Children killed on the Israeli side, 1. Damage to civilian infrastructure. Israel now gives an official figure of $20 million. The minimum figure now for Gaza, is $6 billion. So let's just look at some of the basic ratios. Children killed, 550 to 1. Damage to infrastructure, 300 to 1. Houses destroyed. It's an interesting fact. I went to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs website, and they have a daily diary of everything that was, every kind of damage that was inflicted on them, whether death or property damage. There was one house destroyed, and 11 others were either hit or damaged. Nobody even counted the number of houses destroyed on the Palestinian side. Excuse me, the number of houses hit or damaged. Just houses which have been rendered completely inhabitable. You know what the figure was? It was 18,000. So here are the numbers. 18,000 to 1 with houses, 550 to 1 with children. What was the third number I gave? Property damage, 300 to 1. And then when you open up the Amnesty report, they say, on both sides, civilians once again bore the brunt of the full-scale war. On both sides. You know, it's almost laughable. In the report chronicling Hamas's crimes, they devote 2 full pages to the one 4.5-year-old Daniel Traegerman, who was killed. If you were really interested in balance, that would mean you'd have to devote 1,100 pages, 2 times 550, to the people in Gaza who were killed. This young man laughs. Yes, it's laughable because it's not even thinkable that that would be done. By the end of the Israeli assault, the head of the International Committee of the Red Cross, who, as you can imagine, is familiar with war zones, he said, "I've never seen such massive destruction ever before." Ban Ki-moon said, "The massive deaths and destruction in Gaza have shocked and shamed the world." That's basically what happened. And now we'll look at the more interesting part, the details, and try to understand the dynamics and also to separate out the truth from the fiction. First of all, some things were not so surprising. Israel enjoyed blanket support from the United States throughout the attack. It became a kind of dreaded refrain every day when the State Department or Mr. Obama was asked about the Israeli assault. The answer came back, the mantra was, Israel has the right to self-defense, which was basically a green light for Israel to continue its war crimes. Because already by the 3rd week, even Human Rights Watch was saying Israel is committing war crimes in Gaza. And so in the midst of the major human rights organizations documenting the war crimes being committed, Mr. Obama and his administration just focused on Israel's right to self-defense, which effectively meant Israel's right to continue committing war crimes. It ought not to be forgotten ever that Obama was the enabler-in-chief of Israel's massacre in Gaza. The reason why is not hard to find. Right away as the assault began, the Israel lobby lined up wall-to-wall congressional support. I think the resolution in the Senate, if my memory is correct, and it included Bernie Sanders and it included Elizabeth Warren, was total support for what Israel was doing. And it would have required a certain amount of backbone to defy the U.S. Congress, even if you were inclined to. It's doubtful that Mr. Obama had the inclination, and it's also a fact that he suffers from a significant deficit in spine, and so he enabled Israel to continue. That's not so surprising, but there were other regional developments which, if not surprising, were certainly a source of a dispiriting fact. The Palestine cause, there are some people who go back far enough, and I look at my friend Samira, not because she's the oldest person in the room, but because we met already 30 years ago. 1986 we met at a demonstration. And so she'll know, because her memory goes back also a little further, like my own. There was a time when it was impossible in the Arab world to openly, I'm not saying what goes on behind the scenes, but to openly oppose the Palestinians. The Palestinian cause commanded a huge amount of moral authority in the Arab world, and it was very difficult to defy. This time, things changed a lot. During the Israeli assault on Gaza, Egypt openly supported Israel. Saudi Arabia openly supported Israel. The Emirates openly supported Israel. The Arab League only met once during the whole assault, and during that one meeting, it effectively supported Israel. It said that Hamas should have accepted the ceasefire. I won't go into the ceasefire, but that was a filthy ceasefire proposal that was made, but I don't have time now to go into it. So a significant part of the Arab world at the level of leadership had now switched sides. They were now supporting Israel. That's unprecedented. That's something new. Secondly, at the level of the Arab world, at the popular level, there was very little support registered for the Palestinians, not because of indifference, but for reasons which are perfectly obvious to everyone in the room. If you're an Iraqi, if you're a Yemeni, if you're a Libyan, if you're a Syrian, you have much higher items on your agenda than Palestine. Palestine has significantly dropped on the political agenda in the Arab world. Oddly enough, the only support that came for the people of Palestine, it's a tremendous credit, an honor to the Latin American countries. The Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, El Salvador, somebody here, oh no, may I switch? El Salvador, Chile, Peru, Uruguay, Venezuela, they all registered strong support for the Palestinians and outrage at what was being done to the people of Gaza. It was completely devoid of self-interest. Really very impressive, I think. But as a practical matter, it didn't go very far. And the truth is that this time around, the people of Gaza were alone and abandoned. And in fact, the Palestinian leadership was rooting for Israel. Hamas charged, and I think that's probably true, that the Palestinian Authority members in Gaza supplied 30% of the targets for Israel as it was waging its assault on Gaza. That to me sounds like a credible claim, though obviously one that can't be documented. So that's the international scene. Now let's look at the pretext for the attack. The two main pretexts were in reverse order. There were the terror tunnels and the Hamas rockets. And both of these pretexts were exactly that. They were pretexts. They had precious little fact behind them. So let's go through them quickly. Number one, yes, Hamas built a very sophisticated ramified system of tunnels in Gaza. It was an impressive achievement, it didn't altogether surprise me. I meet many Muslims and Arabs in my travels, and 10 out of every 9 Muslims, 10 out of every 9 Arabs, not 9 out of every 10, 10 out of every 9, is a civil engineer or majoring in civil engineering. So it must be in their DNA at this point. So in Gaza, you had about 1 million unemployed civil engineers. And the people of Gaza are, as you can imagine, they're very creative. You have to be creative to survive a 7-year-long siege, blockade. I teach in Turkey now, and I have one student from Gaza. And when anything goes wrong with the equipment, when anything goes wrong with the lights, I always say, Sadik, get to it. Because I know him, he could turn this bottle with a certain amount of creativity into a spaceship to Mars. And that's the people of Gaza. And with very minimal raw material, they built a quite impressive, as I said, sophisticated, ramified tunnel system in Gaza. And it gave the Israelis a hard time. There's no question about that. When they entered Gaza, they actually never went very far in. They stayed very close to the border. The troops never engaged in a full-fledged invasion. That's just all mythology. They stayed close to the border, and the reason was the tunnel system. As I mentioned to you earlier, during Operation Cast Lead, all of 3 Israeli soldiers were killed. This time they had a harder time. 67 Israeli combatants were killed, and it was basically because the tunnels were not vulnerable to artillery strikes or to bombs. They were pretty deep in the ground. The only way you can disable the tunnels is to go in and detonate them. That was the only way to get rid of them. Israel goes in, it says it wants to detonate these tunnels, but all these Hamas militants are popping out of them because they couldn't kill them. As I said, during Cast Lead, you go in and you flatten everything, you never see a militant. This time they saw Hamas militants because they were in the tunnels. The tunnels were not disabled from the air. They weren't disabled from the artillery shells. The Palestinians kept popping up out of the tunnels, the militants, and 67 Israeli combatants were killed. As I said, a much more impressive showing than happened during Cast Lead. But Israel has a different story to tell. Israel said the reason we had to disable the tunnels is because all of these tunnels were going from under Gaza into Israel, and that they were directed to the civilian sites in the south of Israel, and that they wanted to kill all the Israeli civilians. Well, first of all, let's look at the numbers, because we have the numbers. Israel claims that it disabled 34 tunnels. Of those 34, only 12, according to Israel's own figures, only 12 passed from Gaza into Israel. So the majority of the tunnels Israel itself disabled had nothing to do with cross-border tunnels. Number 2, there's no evidence that Hamas was intending to target Israeli civilians through the tunnels. There were quite a few exchanges with Hamas militants coming out of the tunnels in South Israel, but in every single exchange, it was with soldiers. There was never a single Israeli civilian who was killed by Hamas militants coming out of the tunnels, though there were a significant number of Israeli soldiers who were killed. Number 3, and here our friend from Egypt can help me out, or at least correct me if I'm making an error. Israel said it went into Gaza because of those terror tunnels that were crossing from northern Gaza into Israel. As everybody in this room knows, there was a huge tunnel economy going from Gaza into the northern Sinai. The first thing that Sisi did when he came to power in the coup in July, the first thing he did was he destroyed 90% of the tunnels. But he didn't go into Israel, He didn't go into Gaza and bomb schools, mosques, hospitals to destroy the tunnels. He destroyed the tunnels from his side of the border. You didn't have to go into Gaza to destroy those cross-border tunnels. Now, about a year later, Sisi said there were still militants coming in from Gaza. These tunnels, all of them have to be eliminated. So what did he do? I don't particularly like what he did. I think it was criminal what he did. He displaced a large number of Egyptians on the Egyptian side of the border. And then what did he do? He built a moat on the Egyptian side of the border. He dug a trench, filled it with water, flooded the tunnels. Why did Israel build a moat on its side and flood the tunnels? They had that option. Can anyone possibly believe, if you free yourself from this insane doctrinal system, can anyone possibly believe that Israel did not have earth-moving equipment that could go deeper into the ground than Hamas's implements that it used to make the tunnels and build a moat and just flood the tunnels? Of course they had that option. Egypt used that option. So but was there no truth to the tunnels? Yes, there was some truth to the tunnels. The truth is this. The truth is, periodically, Israel likes to go into Gaza and, to use its favorite expression, mow the lawn. But when it goes in to mow the lawn, it doesn't want to have to suffer these combatant casualties. And it suffered, as I said, a significant number this time for them, 67. So the purpose of the assault was to destroy the tunnels in Gaza, not the tunnels going from Gaza into Israel. It was to destroy all the tunnels, and there is, as I said, not just 34. The way Israel tried to get around what it did, it said we destroyed the known tunnels because it didn't want to have to admit the whole operation was a failure. The whole place now is riddled with tunnels, Gaza. And it was those tunnels which prevented Israel from carrying on a cost-free ground invasion. Those are the tunnels it wanted to destroy. The tunnels not going from Gaza to Israel, the tunnels inside Gaza itself. Okay, now some of you are wondering, okay, maybe that's true, but what about those rockets? Those Hamas rockets. In fact, I'm willing to say it on camera, there were no rockets in Gaza. It's just not true. There were no rockets in Gaza. I know some of you are going to find that hard to swallow and think maybe Finkelstein is going too far. So let's look at the evidence, and then you're going to judge for yourself. I'm going to use only Israeli numbers, which of course are mostly just pulled out of thin air. They are, but we're going to use them. Israel says Hamas fired 4,900 rockets into Israel and 1,800 mortars. So let's just round it out to 7,000 rockets and mortars were fired into Israel. But then Israel also says we had 6 civilian deaths and $20 million in property damage. So the first and most obvious question is, there seems to be a huge discrepancy between this mega barrage of rockets and mortars on the one hand, mortar shells on the one hand, and 6 civilian casualties and $20 million in property damage on the other hand. How could that be? Well, everybody here knows the Israeli explanation is its brilliant anti-missile defense system, Iron Dome. That's the answer they give. Iron Dome saved Israel from thousands and thousands of civilian deaths. That's the claim that's made. So let's use our common sense and let's examine it. Number one, Iron Dome only worked in the populated areas of Israel, the urban areas. That's the only place Iron Dome batteries were set up. Israel says Iron Dome intercepted 735 rockets. Again, I'm sticking strictly now, unless I say so, to Israeli figures. 735 Israeli rockets. The UN official number is 235 rockets. One of the world's leading authorities on anti-missile defense, namely Theodore Postel of MIT, who has a good track record. He was the one who exposed the hoax of the Patriot missile during Desert Storm in 1991. Postel said Iron Dome, at most, it successfully intercepted 5% of the rockets that were fired, which means the brilliant Iron Dome, that great product of American and Israeli genius, its success was 40 rockets. Okay? But let's leave aside Theodore Postel, who, I repeat, is one of the world's leading authorities, and let's take the Israeli figures. So 700, they claim they intercepted 735 rockets. But then do your math. That still leaves over 4,000 rockets. How could 4,000 rockets, leaving aside now the mortar shells, the 2,000 mortar shells, kill only 6 people? How's that possible? So, Postel, he emphasizes in his explanation, he emphasizes not Iron Dome, but the shelter system. Israel has an extremely sophisticated shelter system, which it has in recent years updated with a telephone warning now, an app, to warn Israelis about incoming attacks. Is that really a plausible explanation? With all due credit that goes to Postel, ask yourself, before there was this sophisticated shelter system, it was upgraded significantly after cast lead in 2008-9. Before, what's the record show? I looked at the numbers, and I can promise you I'm not in any way exaggerating to make my argument. I'm using only the Israeli numbers. Between 2001 and 2012, Iron Dome was first deployed during Operation Pillar of Defense in November 2012. Between 2001 and 2012, Israel, according to Israeli figures, fired 14,000 rockets and mortar shells into Israel. There were 23 civilian deaths during that period. That means one civilian death for every 700 rocket and mortar shells. One civilian death for every 700 rocket and mortar shells. How could that be? Then, Operation Cast Lead. Israel fired, they say, about 700 rocket and mortar shells. Just 3 civilians killed. During Operation Protective Edge, as I said, Iron Dome was only deployed around the populated areas. In the south, according to Israel's official figures, 2,000 rockets fell in 2 of the border regions next to Gaza, where there's no Iron Dome, because the distance is too short for it to work effectively. 2,000. rockets. You know how many civilian deaths? 2,000 rockets. 1. That's the official number. 1. Now, again, with all due respect to Postal, we have a problem with his explanation. Though I have to acknowledge it's not his full explanation. I want to be fair to him because he's, in my opinion, a rare bird. He tells the truth. He says to explain the fewness of civilian deaths, you have to look at the shelter system. But there's a problem. The problem is, as you all know, hospitals don't take cover in shelters. Schools don't take cover in shelters. Houses don't take cover in shelters. How could it possibly be 5,000 rockets are fired into Israel, a maximum of 735, according to Israel, are intercepted by Iron Dome? How could 4,900 rockets only destroy one house? One house. And we're leaving aside for a moment the mortars shells, the 1,800 mortars. How is that possible? There's only one possible explanation. They weren't rockets. They were just enhanced fireworks. And the problem was both Israel and Hamas had a mutual stake in this pretense that they were rockets. Israel, so it could justify the murder and mayhem, were under this relentless rocket assault. And Hamas, because it wanted to show that armed resistance works. So it kept talking and boasting about these rockets, which were nothing more than Roman candles. Well, it's a fact. I mean, even if Israel posts the pictures of what was hit, there's only one building, one, that was significantly damaged. If you look at the pictures, they'll say house hit. As I mentioned, there were 11 houses which were damaged. You just see a hole in the roof. That's it. Or you see a broken window. There were no rockets. There couldn't be rockets. For a very simple reason. Whatever rockets Hamas had, it used during Operation Pillar of Defense in November 2012. And then shortly after Pillar of Defense, there was the coup in Egypt. And the first thing Sisi did was seal 90% of the tunnels. Nothing could get in. How could they have these sophisticated rockets? If you read Amnesty International, like all the other organizations, it lists all these ominous rockets in the Hamas arsenal. There are Fajr rockets from Iran, and there are Grad missiles, and there are Qassam missiles, and this and that and that. And it conjures up this image, this nightmare scenario, as Amnesty put it, the circle of fear in Israel. The circle of fear is getting bigger and bigger. Actually, Amnesty was so silly, really, so embarrassingly silly, that at one point they write, let me just get it, they say, the majority of Israel's 8.3 million people and all 2.8 million Palestinians in the occupied West Bank are now within range of at least some of the rockets held by Palestinian armed groups in the Gaza Strip. The circle of fear has widened. The Palestinians in the West Bank? They are fearful every night of Hamas rockets?
They are fearful every night of the Israeli army.
It's Palestinians. There's an interesting point there, which I'm happy to get to at the end, what's happening. Yeah, it is an interesting question, what's going on. In any case, the other point I was going to make is, in the case of I said they couldn't have rockets. First of all, because the tunnels had been sealed. And secondly, because Israel itself admitted during Operation Pillar of Defense in 2012, a handful of rockets reached Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. You remember 2 or 3. When Israel was asked about them, they said, quote, they were pipes, basically. Namely, in order to reach that distance, they had to take off the warhead. It's a very limited technology they have at their disposal. Are you telling me in the space of 20 months between Pillar of Defense and Protective Edge, they somehow managed this technological miracle of creating rockets with explosive warheads, which now threatened Israel's urban areas? It's just not plausible. If these rockets were so terrifying, why were the people in the Southern Committee of Siderut, they called it the Siderut Cinema, they set up chairs to watch what was going on in Gaza? I wouldn't be out there if I heard that there's a terrifying arsenal of Hamas rockets. I'd be in my shelter. Well, how does the whole thing end? Let me just get to that now, and we'll be done. The ending is quite interesting, what happened. As I mentioned at the beginning, Israel started to target the UN shelters. It began around July 21st. It targeted one UN school converted into a shelter, then a second UN school turned into a shelter, a third UN school converted into a shelter, a fourth, a fifth. And now the pressure begins to build up on Ban Ki-moon from within the UN. These are UN facilities. The UN has a sprawling organization, and they don't like to be killed by Israelis. So the pressure starts building now inside the UN. Ban Ki-moon, you comatose puppet of the United States, why aren't you saying anything? And finally, he had to say something on August 3rd. By then, 44 Palestinians had been killed, several hundred had been injured inside the shelters. And finally, he had to say something. And Ban Ki-moon, he said, he called what Israel did a moral outrage and criminal act. And now the U.S. had a real problem. Even its puppet, even Ban Ki-moon, was now denouncing what Israel is doing. And the U.S. was completely isolated internationally. Every rat had jumped off the ship, the sinking ship, including Ban Ki-moon. And so finally, the U.S. had to say something. And on August 3rd, as I said, Ban Ki-moon finally speaks up. August 3rd, the U.S. finally says something. They say they're appalled by this disgraceful act. And then the third step is the same day, everything happens on August 3rd. Netanyahu announces the ground invasion is over. And now they're looking for negotiations. Unfortunately, the negotiations dragged out longer than expected because another gift fell into Israel's lap. And that was the ISIS beheading of the American reporter. All of a sudden, this phenomenon, nobody had even heard of it, this thing called ISIS came out of nowhere. All the cameras turned to ISIS, the reporter, and that phenomenon. And now Israel has a free hand again. And the last 3 weeks, from August 3rd to August 26th, Israel just carried on a murder spree. Some of you will remember it was kind of like a computer game. They started to target the landmark high-rise houses in Gaza, high-rise apartment buildings. 1, 2, 3, and 4. It was just pure terror attack to try to break the will of the people of Gaza. Surprisingly, or unsurprisingly, depending on your take on it, they were unsuccessful in breaking the will of the people of Gaza. Actually, most of the civilian casualties occurred in the very last week. And the casualties start to go up. It went from 1 to 6, which was significant for the Israelis. And then both sides decided they can't win, and the assault was over. Ended on August 26th. In my opinion, for what it's worth, neither side won. You might recall from when I began, Israel's original goal was to delegitimize Hamas, which had entered into negotiations indirectly with the US and the EU. By the end, Israel was negotiating with Hamas to achieve a ceasefire proposal agreement. So Israel, its main political goal was to delegitimize Hamas. In the end, Israel itself legitimized Hamas. On the Palestinian side, their main goal has been the same always. Their goal is uncontroversial, always very clear. They want to end the inhuman, illegal, immoral siege of Gaza. And each time they have attempted, 2009, when Cast-Lead ended, there was a promise to lift the siege. Promise was ignored. 2012, again at the end of Operation Pillar of Defense, the siege was supposed to be lifted. It was ignored. The third time, again, there was a promise to end the siege, and it was perfectly obvious, I said so at the time, Israel is never going to lift the siege because it won't give Hamas a political victory. If it lifts the siege, Hamas can declare, we won the war. And Israel will never give Hamas that victory. And so to this day, not a single house has been rebuilt in Gaza, not one. There's a trickle of construction material being allowed in, but they say at the current rate it would take 10 years to rebuild the houses, but there's still reasons why they can't rebuild the houses. And so neither side won. Just my last word, and the last word is Hamas has every right under international law to use armed force in order to end the assault on Gaza. Hamas is constantly attacked for using these, what are called under international law, indiscriminate weapons, because the so-called rockets have no guidance system. The mortar shells cannot be aimed accurately in densely populated areas. So under international law, everything Hamas does except breathing, it's illegal. No, that's the fact. It's illegal under international law. That's what the human rights organizations say. And also, they're also attacked because you're not allowed, they claim, you're not allowed to fight from densely populated areas. The technical term is you have to take all feasible precautions not to launch, for example, rockets from densely populated areas. So Amnesty in its report says, well, it's true Gaza is among the most densely populated places on Earth, but they say there's a couple of small areas which are not populated. Hamas can fight from there. Well, the bottom line is what they're telling to Hamas is this is what you can do. All Hamas militants can go to this little football field or soccer field. You can lay down all your weapons because they're all illegal under international law. And you can all line up and be shot down like ducks by Israel. That's your only right under international law. That's the law, according to all the human rights organizations. I'm not going to argue about the law right here. I don't agree with certain of the human rights organizations' interpretations of the law, just as a factual matter. Every human rights organization, they always come forward, whether it's Kenneth Roth from Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International, they say, with Hamas, it's an open and shut case. Why? We don't even have to investigate, they say. That's literally what they say. We don't even have to investigate because they're using indiscriminate weapons. And so, every time they use the weapon, regardless if it kills anyone, every time they just use the weapon, they're committing a war crime. That's the standard. And it's repeated over and over and over again. So if you take the example of Kenneth Roth, he says, it's obviously easier to denounce as a war crime Hamas's efforts to shoot rockets into civilian areas. That, you know, is blatantly obvious. It doesn't take a huge investigation to figure that one out. Israel, it does take more of an investigation. Or, well, I can give you other examples. So Hamas, it's an open and shut case. Just look at the numbers. Just look at the numbers. Hamas fired 4,900 rockets and 1,800 mortar shells. Altogether, about 7,000 rockets or mortar shells were fired. According to all the human rights organizations, this is obviously, clearly, blatantly, or as Amnesty said, flagrantly a war crime. Now, let's leave aside all of Israel's precision weapons. Israel fired 19,000 high explosive artillery shells into populated areas in Gaza. They are also indiscriminate weapons, automatically illegal under international law. The one serious investigation that was done found they fired those 19,000 high explosive artillery shells. 95% were fired into densely populated areas of Gaza. Do you see the numbers? More than double. That's not a complicated case. I'm leaving aside all their drones, all their precision weapons, their whole high-tech arsenal. I'm just limiting myself to making the comparison. Indiscriminate weapons, easy case. Obvious, says Amnesty. Obvious, says Human Rights Watch. And then why isn't the Israeli case obvious? 19,000 high explosive artillery shells in urban areas. That's an indiscriminate weapon. The artillery shell could not target a site. It's admitted. In fact, the artillery shells are doubly indiscriminate. They're indiscriminate because they can't target a site, and they're indiscriminate because they're such explosive weapons that they blow everything up all around their target. So they're doubly indiscriminate. Now, the funny thing is, I can assure you, not knowing anyone in this room, nobody has ever even heard mention of the Israeli artillery shells. It's not even a subject. It's not even a topic. 19,000. Well, leaving all that aside, does Hamas have the right to fire those projectiles? The human rights organizations say no. Let's hear what Gandhi would have to say. Everybody always talks about Gandhi as the apostle of nonviolence, apostle of peace. But Gandhi had a lot of reservations, qualifications, and caveats. Let me just give you one, and we'll end it at that, because I know I'm going on longer than I should. I read a lot the past week, and it's fresh in my mind. So Gandhi said, I don't consider all forms of violence really violence. So he gave a couple of examples. He says, say a woman is attacked by a rapist. And to resist, he says, she scratches him, she pummels him. He says, well, I guess technically that's violence, but I don't really consider that violence. He says, what that really is a woman trying to summon up the moral strength to die with dignity. He says, take the case of Poland in 1939. Germany has the Luftwaffe, the Air Force, the Wehrmacht, the army. They invade Poland. Poland has a couple of artillery pieces, 4 or 5 tanks. Gandhi says, when you have such a huge discrepancy in arsenals, if Poland resists with its tiny arsenal of weapons, the Luftwaffe and the Wehrmacht. Gandhi said, in my book, that's not violence. That's just trying to die with dignity. Anyone who knows the real Gandhi, not the Gandhi of mythology, the real Gandhi was, his cardinal principle was not nonviolence. That's not true. His cardinal principle was courage. For him, the most important human value was courage. That's why he admired the fighters in ancient Sparta. In his view, for reasons which I don't have time to go into now, it took a lot more courage to be nonviolent than it did to be violent. Again, there is an explanation, time doesn't allow me. But for him, the cardinal value was courage and dignity. He once said to his son, if you see somebody beating me badly, and you don't have the courage to intercede between the person and me, he said, you better not run. That makes you a coward. Then you hit back, and you hit back hard. Now, those weren't rockets Hamas was firing. Those are, at most, symbolic weapons that they fired. They were an SOS to the world. We're dying. We're dying. We've been under the siege for 7 years. 95% of the water in Gaza is not fit for human consumption. Many of you in this room, you have bottled water or you bring in water delivered. And New York tap water is already pretty clean. Now imagine if you have children and each time you give them a cup of water, you're conscious of the fact that you're poisoning them because that water is not fit for human consumption. And you're telling me that these people in that situation don't have the right to send up what are effectively flares to the world, SOS, we're dying. You want to convince me that they are war crimes? Maybe technically they are war crimes. I can't ask Gandhi now what he would say, but I have a pretty good hunch he would say, you know what? Like the rapist, like the women resisting the rapist, like Poland in 1939, the people of Gaza have the right to fire those projectiles. And on this particular question, as much as I respect Amnesty International, I'm with Gandhi. They had the right. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Norman. Perhaps we can open it up now if people have questions.